everybody. My name is Janay Anthony, and welcome to Solar and Lunar Returns. So this is going to be a lecture about how to read and use primarily solar return charts, but a lot of the things that we'll be talking about will also apply to lunar returns as well. So it's kind of interchangeable knowledge. But yes, I just want to say I'm so honored and excited that Stormie invited me to teach this class. And if you hear random noises in the background, I'm sorry. That's my cat. She just decided to start making noise as I started to record this. So thanks, Madeline. Anyways, like I said, my name is Janay Anthony. I have been studying and practicing astrology and tarot since about 2012, so about the past 9 years or so. I am also the vice president for the Association for Young Astrologers, and most of my work, especially over the past year and a half or so, has been with the organization. So if you've got time, definitely go check that out. AYA is a great org to get involved in, and there's not much else I want to plug at this moment, so let's just get into the lecture. So yes, let's dive straight into this lecture. This is going to be Solar and Lunar Returns, Revelations for the Year Ahead. And as mentioned, my name is Janay Anthony, and I will be your astrologer for today. Okay, so before we get into the meaty part of this, we first have to understand what is a solar return chart and what is a lunar return chart. As I briefly mentioned before, a lot of the techniques will be interchangeable between solar and lunar returns. So for the sake of keeping things simplistic, I will mostly be referring to solar returns throughout this lecture, but just remember that the things we can talk about can be applied to both kinds of charts. So anyways, what is a solar return chart? Okay, so I love this quote from Anthony Lewis's book, The Art of Forecasting Using Solar Returns. And so this is a way that he likes to conceptualize solar returns in the book. The solar return is a key that in any given year can unlock the potential of the birth chart. So a solar return chart is a chart that is cast for the exact moment that the transiting sun in the sky is exactly conjunct your natal sun. So essentially it's when the sun is returning back to the same place in the zodiac where it was at the time of your birth. And this happens approximately once every year. It can be a day or two before or a day or two after your actual birth date, but because our years are based off of the rotation of the sun, when the sun comes back to where it was when you were born, it's essentially just 1 year. So it'll be around your birthday every year, which is why a lot of the times when people offer birthday readings or birthday forecasts, a lot of the times they'll be referring to solar return charts. And for the lunar return chart, we take that same concept of the luminary returning back to the place where it was on the day of your birth. And so a lunar return is when the moon goes around the zodiac and comes back to where it was when you were born. And the moon takes approximately 28 days, give or take a few hours, to travel around the zodiac. And so you will have a lunar return approximately once a month. Okay, so now that we hopefully understand what a return chart is, what is a return chart used for? Yes, so return charts can be used for yearly and monthly predictions using solar and lunar charts respectively. They can also be used to set intentions. In the case of lunar return charts, I know a lot of people like to use them for tracking fertility and planning things around fertility. That has not been my personal practice, but it's really cool. It's really, really cool that people some people use lunar returns that way. Okay, so we are going to spend the next chunk of time talking about the various principles to use when interpreting a solar return chart. First and foremost, you have to get your solar return chart. And so most astrology softwares and most astrology websites have the option, there goes my cat running around again, sorry, but most astrology websites and software have the option to pull up your solar return, lunar returns as well, but we're keeping it focused on solar returns for the time being. So for a long time, I used astro.com. I now use SolarFire, and I know that a lot of other places where you can pull up a natal chart also has the option for solar returns. So whatever your modality of pulling up charts, you can probably do some digging to find the solar return settings. And so when looking at this new chart, here are the things that you want to keep in mind. The first thing that I always just laser focus look at any chart really, including the solar return chart, is the ascendant. You'll want to pay special attention to the sign and the degree of the ascendant, and also if there are any planets that are rising, conjunct the ascendant, or in the first house. All of this will give you, kind of the flavor of what the year will be like. And when examining the ascendant, by extension, you'll also want to look at the planet that rules the ascendant. And so, basic astrology, every sign of the zodiac is ruled by a planet. And so you'll want to investigate where the planet that rules the sign of the ascendant, you'll want to look at what is going on with that planet in the chart. Personally, I like to consider if it's a benefic or a malefic planet. I also look at the essential and accidental dignity of the planet. And just as to give a couple definitions, the essential dignity is essentially, the sign that the planet is in. Is it exalted? Is it in domicile? Is it in fall? Just what is the essential dignity of that planet. And accidental dignity refers to the house that planet is in and the different aspects that it's making. And after looking at the ascendant and the planet ruling the ascendant, I then like to look at the luminaries, the sun and the moon. And this, of course, is in both solar and lunar return charts. But specifically in the solar return chart, what the sun is doing can also give more clues to what the year ahead is going to be like. So you'll want to look at what house is the sun placed in, and also what house is Leo in the solar return chart, because of course the sun rules the sign of Leo. And so the placement of the sun will give you an idea of what different topics might be highlighted for the year ahead. You'll also want to pay attention to what the moon is doing in the solar return chart. I view the moon, specifically in the context of solar return charts, kind of just like how your state of being may be for the year ahead, or just like the condition of the environment, right? So if the moon is very nicely placed, you might be feeling great about yourself over the next year. If the moon is having some challenging things, it happens, it's fine. You might expect to also be going through emotional challenges that year, or you might find it more difficult to cope with the challenges that come up around you in life. But I just like to use the moon as a general signifier of what is this year going to feel like, just generally. And then other things in the chart will point to the specific topics that will be making you feel that way. After looking at the ascendant and after examining the luminaries, the next step is to look at the other planets. So it's kind of like a 1, 2, 3 step: ascendant, luminaries, other planets. So when looking at the other planets, I like to consider if any of them are angular, that is, are they conjunct the ascendant, the descendant, the MC, or the IC? Also, if they are in the first, fourth, seventh, or 10th house, because even a planet that isn't, closely conjunct the cusp, if it's in the house, I still consider it to be an angular planet, even if it's not conjunct the angle. So those are things I like to look at. You also want to look at any major aspects that the planets have to each other, to the ascendant, to the MC, to, the sun and the moon. All the different things you'd want to consider when interpreting a natal chart, you apply that to the solar return chart and just interpret it within the context of, the next 12 months rather than a life. Okay, so we've looked at the ascendant and its ruling planet. We've checked out those luminaries. We've assessed what's going on with the other planets in the chart. And now it's time to come up with a theme. Like, what are the themes of the chart, and are there any patterns that are being repeated throughout the chart? The different patterns that you notice going on in the solar return chart will often reflect the topics that will come up over the next year. So let's take a look at an example and see if we can figure out what's going on. Okay, so here is a chart of a friend whom I've named Sarah for the sake of this lecture. It's a fake name, gotta protect confidentiality. But this is Sarah's solar return chart. And so if we go through the steps that we've just outlined above, let's see what's going on with this chart. So the first thing to do is to look at the ascendant, and right off the bat, it sticks out like a sore thumb. There is a lot, let me say that again, there is a lot going on with the ascendant in this chart. We've got the ascendant at 11 degrees Virgo. We also have Venus, Mars, and Jupiter also in Virgo, also conjunct the ascendant. So it is a little bit atypical to have 3 planets conjunct the ascendant, but it's just something to take a note of. There's a lot of stuff happening in the first house in this chart. And of course, Virgo is ruled by Mercury, so I would then want to look at what Mercury is doing in this chart, because it's the ruler of the entire chart. So it's a very important planet in this case. And as you can see, Mercury is in the second house with the sun, which is really interesting because that brings us to the next step of looking at what the luminaries are doing in this chart. So as mentioned, the sun is in Libra in the second house, and we're already starting to see some patterns come up, right? You kind of want to keep note of all the patterns you're noticing as you go throughout the steps, instead of doing everything, then going back and finding the patterns. But we already have 2 very important planets in the second house. And so you might expect themes around finances and security to be a major player in the year ahead for Sarah. And now let's look at the moon to get a sense of the general feel that would be going on for Sarah in this year. We can see that the moon is in the 4th house, it's in Sagittarius. So Sagittarius moons, I love me a Sag moon, and it makes me think of just a sense of adventure and optimism and exploration. And in the 4th house, you might be thinking of, the home, or, just your roots and where you come from. And so to me, this seems like there might be some sense of adventure in terms of what Sarah considers to be home. And fast forwarding a little bit, because the beautiful thing about astrology is that as hard as you try, as hard as I try, let me not project things, but as hard as I try to keep it to a linear step 1, step 2, step 3, I'm always jumping around. Your eye just takes you places, and you got to follow that, follow your intuition and follow your instinct. But all that to say is, in this chart, it's very important to note that the moon in Sagittarius is squaring all of those planets in the first house. And of course, a square is an aspect of tension. And so this to me seems like, this sense of adventure in the home coming into conflict with who Sarah believes that she is, as an individual. Like, what is her identity and why is that conflicting with her sense of home? There are lots of other things to take notice of in this chart, but typically I can spend an entire hour talking about a solar return chart, so we're gonna keep it brief for the sake of this lecture. But just super generally, the ascendant, the luminaries, then the other planets, those are kind of the things we're going to examine in this lecture, just for the sake of not having this be a 5-hour-long class with all these examples. Okay, so what are some of the things we noticed about that chart? We noted all of that first house activity with the Venus, Mars, and Jupiter rising. And that is a jam-packed first house, right? You might even call that a first house stellium in Virgo. I would call it that because there's just so much going on there. And another important pattern to note about this chart is that the chart ruler and the sun, which is a very important planet in a solar return chart, both of those planets are in the second house. And so as of right now, we've got first house activity, we've got second house activity, and looking at the other luminary, the moon, we incorporate some fourth house activity as well, because of course, the moon in Sagittarius was squaring all of those planets in the first house. And so I like to think of charts as stories. You look at a chart, you unpack a narrative and see what you get. So based on these things, I would expect the story of this chart to be something along the lines of, something about Sarah's identity is coming into conflict with her sense of home. And while all of that is going on, there's also activity in the second house, which is bringing up finances. So there might be a focus on finances due to this conflict between identity and home, or this conflict between identity and home could be impacting finances in some way. But hold up just a second, because we can't just look at the solar return chart. To get a full picture, we also need to consider what's going on with the natal chart. And here's another quote from Anthony Lewis's book about solar returns. Imagine you find a key on the sidewalk. You can study the key and make educated guesses about the type of lock it fits. Sometimes the key itself can be informative, but a complete picture will not emerge until you find the corresponding lock. And in our case, the corresponding lock to the key of the solar return chart is the natal chart. And so let's take a look at Sarah's solar return chart along with her natal chart. But before we look at the overlay, let's go through a couple principles when looking at the solar and natal chart. When looking at the solar return and natal charts together. That's what I was trying to say. The first thing you'll want to take note of is what house in your natal chart is the ascendant of the solar return chart falling into. There's going to be a lot of words. I hope I can say it in a way that you can follow along. But yeah, so what house is the ascendant of the solar return chart in your natal chart? Another thing to take note of is where the moon in the solar return chart is falling in the natal chart. And then, of course, any aspects that are happening between the planets in the solar return chart and the natal planets. Okay, so let's look at this example. So in this bi-wheel, we have Sarah's natal chart on the inner circle and the solar return chart on the outer circle. And as mentioned, one of the first things that we look at when we're looking at the overlay is where did that solar return ascendant fall in the natal chart? And we can see that for this year, the ascendant is falling in Sarah's 10th house. And even more spectacular is that it's falling like right on her Venus. So keeping with, looking at patterns, we have Venus on the ascendant in the solar return chart, but also the solar return ascendant making a conjunction with the natal Venus. So you might expect Venusian things to come into play for this year. And along those lines, all of that first house energy in the solar return chart is in Sarah's 10th house natally. So there might be career developments or something to do with reputation, because that's a lot of stuff happening in that 10th house there. So you can expect some sort of development to happen. Also, when looking at this overlay, you'll see that the moon is in Sarah's natal first house, which is just lighting up first house themes of identity again. And, so we have this first house, fourth house, 10th house, second house, all of the topics of those houses coming together to create a story. And so, before our story, it was about the pull between identity and home and conflict between those things and how that might impact finances. And when we consider that story with the natal chart, it talks about even more identity coming into play. And also, the career, the work, reputation. While vacationing in Italy with a close friend, Sarah met a local man who'd soon become a long-term romantic partner. She'd been considering moving to Italy, and this relationship expedited her decision to make the move. Upon returning home from vacation, Sarah started to put her affairs in order to make the move to Italy. 6 years later, Sarah and her partner are still together and living in Rome. Still together and living in Rome. That's so beautiful. So when we look back at this chart, you can very clearly see how, relationships of romance would be very highlighted in this year. You also get the theme of exploration and travel with the solar return moon being in Sagittarius. And keep in mind that all of this stuff is, in that first house, fourth house conflict. And so who Sarah believed herself to be was somebody who wanted to live in Rome. And, she didn't feel at home in the US anymore. And especially by going abroad and meeting a partner, that was the inspiration she needed to, finally make that move overseas. And of course, all of that second house stuff coming into play, because moving house isn't cheap, especially if you're going to do it to a different country. There's a lot that needs to go into that, like lots of planning, lots of selling stuff, making sure that, Sarah's steps were taken care of. She did all of that when she came back from vacation. So I think this return chart kind of perfectly illustrated what was going to happen for her this year. Okay, here is another example chart. So let's start off by looking at the ascendant. And when looking at this chart, again, something that it sticks out at you is how much is going on in that first house, right? Not everything is conjunct the degree of the ascendant, but it's all in the first house. So again, something to do with identity this year. And this idea of identity is being emphasized with the sun being conjunct the ascendant. Of course, both the sun and the ascendant have to do with how one identifies themselves, right? Who someone is in their core. And so both of these coming together, especially, the sun conjunct the ascendant in the solar return chart, like that is a lot of energy around a person's sense of self. And of course, Venus rules the sign of Libra, so that rules the ascendant. And we have Venus in the 12th house. And nobody really enjoys being in the 12th house. It's not the happiest place, especially for Venus. And so, there might be feelings of isolation this year. And so, I'm already starting to put together a story in my head with the first house and 12th house themes coming up where, a person might be doubting themselves because of the isolation they're facing, or the isolation may allow them to, renew themselves and have a new sense of who they are. Now let's take a look at what the moon is doing here. In this chart, we have another moon in Sagittarius. This time it's in the 3rd house. And so, 3rd house has to do with, communication, short distance travel, your immediate environment, transportation. So I'm wondering, how is this all going to come together? This sense of isolation, this sense of self, and the community around you, how is that going to play out? And one thing I forgot to mention a little bit earlier is that because the sun is so close to that ascendant, the house that the sun is ruling is also going to come into play. So what is that in this chart? Here we have the sun ruling Leo, of course, and Leo is the 11th house. We also have the MC in the 11th house because I use whole sign. And so we have the sun ruling the MC conjunct the ascendant. And to me, that looks like, major developments of one's identity, perhaps in the sphere of work because of the MC, also in the sphere of reputation amongst friends or network circles. So it'll be interesting to find out what that actually means. So the themes in this chart are definitely a sense of self, some sort of development with a sense of self, perhaps in terms of a network circle or a career move, and also, something going on with the immediate environment and also being isolated somehow, because we have those 1st house, 3rd house, 11th house / MC, and 12th house themes coming up in this. But of course, that chart cannot stand in isolation. So what are the different things that we notice about the overlay? One of the first things I notice about this overlay is that the ascendant is exactly on the natal south node. And so, the nodes are a big story. I could go into a huge rabbit hole about the nodes, but we're going to keep it simple and to the point here. There might be some sort of letting go, especially with it being on the south node, or just some sort of massive shrinking in some way, because I view the south node as taking away or just dispersing. And so maybe all of this identity stuff is coming up because, the ego is dispersing and, could be other things. You don't know, I know, because me and Sarah talked about this chart, but let's keep exploring to see what else this could be talking about. Also in this overlay, you can notice that the ascendant in the solar return chart is falling into Sarah's natal 11th house, which also contains her MC. So again, we have that reiteration of this 11th house MC connection coming up. And then moving on to look at the moon in the solar return chart, you can see that the moon is, you know, because it's in Sagittarius again, it's going to fall into Sarah's first house. But in this chart, we have the moon conjunct Mars. We have the solar return moon conjunct natal Mars, which could be talking about some sort of discomfort or some sort of challenge around identity, right? Because it is in the first house. So this is very interesting. The first house themes were just like completely drilled, completely drilled into these charts. Like something with identity is going on here. Some major development is going to happen. Other themes include network circles and friends and career, and how perhaps how somebody is perceived, with the MC being so highlighted in both of these charts. So perhaps some highlight by colleagues that will challenge Sarah's identity somehow. And so let's find out what happened this year. So this year, Sarah got a promotion that realized her long-standing dream of working in New York City for a very specific big name production company. She didn't tell me what company that was. So I don't know, but it was a very big company and she'd been dreaming about this since high school. So that's an amazing accomplishment for her. She spent very little time at home because the job required her to travel across the Midwest and Northeastern United States. Although Sarah spent the company's money to finance lavish PR campaigns and dinners for clients, her personal finances were very tight and she barely had enough for anything besides rent and groceries. So let's take a look at this chart once again. The MC first house stuff definitely makes so much sense because the sun is also about recognition and being uplifted and upheld. So Sarah literally got to be elevated to a place that she had always dreamed of being. And that's very strong with, you know, the ruler of the MC being conjunct the ascendant. And, you know, it turns out that the South Node stuff had to do with Sarah realizing that this position that she had been dreaming for since high school actually wasn't really what she wanted. And so she achieved her dream and had to start thinking about, like, who is she now that she finally got where she wanted to go? And, you know, is this actually who she wants to be, what she wants to do? The answer to that was no, because the answer with the South Node is usually going to be, no, this is not what you want. But the fact that Sarah was able to achieve her goals and rise to the spot where she wanted to be, or where she thought she wanted to be, I think that is definitely indicated by the solar return chart. Okay, now moving on, here's a question I kind of avoided up until now because there are so many different opinions, well, technically 2 different opinions on whether you should relocate the solar return or use the natal location for solar return charts. Like I said, many different astrologers have varying views on this. I personally like to use the natal location. I've just personally found that it works better. And even in my examples, like I mentioned, Sarah moved to Italy, and she spent more than a couple years in Italy at this point, but she was born in the US, and I find that using the natal location for all of those returns seemed to line up more with what happened for her in the course of that year. Other astrologers may have found different. It might also depend on what you're specifically looking for in a solar return chart, if you want to relocate it or use the natal location. But I personally, Janay Anthony, uses the natal location, but you don't have to do that. You can use what works best for you. Okay, we spent a lot of time talking about solar return charts, but this is also a bit of a lunar return chart class as well. So I'm going to get into how to apply everything we just learned in lunar return charts. And it's also very fitting that the sun is now going down and it's getting dark as I prepare to talk about lunar return charts. But anyways, okay, so when looking at a lunar return chart, like I said, all of the same principles, all the same techniques apply, except you just want to change the context of how you're interpreting it. So whereas in the solar return chart, the sun plays a huge role in what's going on there. The same will be true for the lunar return chart, and you'll want to look at primarily what's going on with the moon. So you'll want to look at the ascendant and the ruler of the ascendant. You'll want to look at the luminaries, primarily focusing on the moon, but also, what the sun might be doing in the chart as well. And then also what's going on with the other planets in that chart, if any of them are angular or making important aspects. And then of course, when looking at a lunar return chart, you'll want to pick out any themes or patterns you see, and then overlay that with the natal chart and see if those patterns are emphasized or if some new story starts to emerge. And so for the sake of time, we're not going to go into a lunar return chart example just because it's kind of the exact same principles as interpreting a solar return chart. So I just didn't think it was important to show the exact same thing. And so a very cool thing about solar return charts and lunar return charts, really just return charts of any kind, because you can do a return chart with any and all planets, which is interesting once you start to dive down the rabbit hole, but you can use them with other techniques. I personally love to use solar return charts with annual perfections because, it's kind of the yearly way of timing things, the solar return happening every year around your birthday, and then, your perfection year changing every year on your birthday. They kind of line up really, really great and really complement each other. So for instance, in my year ahead readings, I always look at the solar return chart and throw in perfections in there as well. And that will just give you an even deeper understanding of what the key of the solar return is unlocking for you for this year. Transits are also another technique that people use with solar return charts. Some astrologers like to look at transits to the solar return chart on its own. Some like to see, for instance, if there's a square between a solar return planet and a planet in the natal chart, somebody might look at, a transiting planet to see if it will make a T-square out of that aspect. It can get real complex. I personally don't use transits with solar return charts. I know other people do, and that's completely valid as well. What other things? You can really use solar return planets. You can use solar return charts or return charts in general with any technique that you want, because that's another beautiful thing about astrology. Of all the beautiful things about astrology, you really do have the liberty to, pick and match and make your own practice what you want your own practice to be, and you can make it completely unique, and it can just be your style, and that's great. And so I do know that this is going to be pre-recorded. Well, of course I do. I'm recording right now. But if you are watching this during the premiere, definitely take some time right now to put your questions in the chat. Or if you're catching this on, the rewind, that's not how you say that. Or if you're catching this a little bit later, put your questions in the comments, and I'll definitely try to respond to as many questions as possible and answer all of those brilliant questions, because I know all of you are super smart and are just coming up with amazing questions right now. But yes, that brings us to the end of this lecture, and I just wanted to list out a couple of the references I used. Of course, I quoted Anthony Lewis. His book was amazing. The Art of Forecasting Using Solar Return Charts. It was a huge help to me in coming up with this lecture. Lots of great reference material in that book. So if you need it's not too dense. There are definitely some basic concepts you should understand before diving into that book, but it is a pretty easy read for the late beginner intermediate stage of learning. Another book that I kind of skimmed, didn't get too deep into, was Planets and Solar Return Charts by Mary Fortier Shea. I believe Anthony Lewis referenced her in his book. So again, I didn't go too deep into that one, so I can't recommend one way or another what that book might be like for you. And then I am also a huge auditory learner, so I like to listen to the podcast. And so the astrology podcast episode, Abu Mashar on Solar Revolutions with Benjamin Dykes, was, a very great podcast to listen to. I just got my hands on Benjamin Dykes' translation, so the universe brought it to me after I was already done putting this lecture together. So I'm excited to dive into that book and see what I can, pull out from that text. And then another helpful podcast episode that I listened to was How to Make the Best of Your Solar Return with Frank Clifford from Astrology Hub. And so these are just a few of the references I used. There are so many more resources out there that you can come to. The podcast episodes were, of course, free. I bought the Kindle versions of those books on Amazon, and they weren't too expensive, so they're semi-accessible. But there's definitely a lot of great material out there on solar returns for you to dive into. And so, yeah, that brings me to the very end of this lecture. I am so appreciative of you for watching this. And if you're interested in getting in contact with me, you can visit my website, astrologybyjanay.com. You can email me, astrologybyjanay@gmail.com. And then, of course, my YouTube channel, which isn't too active lately, but I would still appreciate a follow or recommendations on videos you might want to see. But my YouTube channel is Astrology by Janay, and then you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Janay Astrology. That's Janay Astrology. So yeah, again, thank you for watching this. I hope you've learned something new. And of course, just continue to keep all those marvelous questions coming down in the comments, and I'll try to get back to you. Thanks for watching. Bye, everybody.